This is Pat Tormey, and today we're going to be talking about using reports in smart client applications. Since we're talking about smart clients, then of course it would be a good idea to start by building some kind of a web service. So I'm going to say New, Project, and I'm going to tell it I'm looking for, in particular, a web service. And we'll leave it called Web Service 1. Okay, we always get this as a freebie, which is kind of your model with what you need. We don't actually want to say hello world. That's not too useful for us. So what we're going to do next is add a data source. In this case, we're going to go to a database. And I'm going to suggest a new connection. We use a SQL database file. Browse to a location where I know I have some data. And we can leave the rest of this alone. Quick test. He likes his connection. Moving on. And in this case, I'm going to let it go ahead and copy it so you'll have a copy of the database. That's a good enough name for my connection string. We'll accept that. In this case, I'm going to be using a view. And the view I want in particular is sales by category. Okay, so what did this get for us? Well, let's go over here and look at sales by category. And the first thing we want to do is take a peek at the data. Make sure we got something that we can do some math with. Yeah, that looks pretty good. But I see a problem here. I have a repeating category ID. And I just noticed that this has the flag set for primary key because it inherited that from the original category table. So what I'll do here is tell it just to delete the key. This won't change anything because it's read-only data. It may make things a little slower. But we can live with that since it won't work at all without it. Okay, another thing I need to do here, I think, is we'll drop in and sort my data in advance. And I'll sort by company name. Okay, I like that. And those statements are still pretty good, so we'll just leave them alone. Now, I don't like to see spaces in any of these table names and table adapter names. And the convenient thing that Visual Studio does for us is if I rename the data set, it'll automatically rename the table adapter for me. And that keeps things in sync and keeps things kind of nice. All right, so what are we going to do next? Well, we got it back to our web service here. And this is our basic web service, which of course we don't need anymore. So I'll take that out of there. I always leave it commented because you never can be sure. So let's go over and take a look at what would happen. What I really need next is a new web. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is make a public function that returns our data set. So it's going to be a web method. There, that'll do that. And this one's going to be called public function get sales by category, and it's going to come back as the Northwind data set. Okay, so I don't type that great. Alright, now the first thing we're going to have to do is to dim a data set as a new Northwind. And I always want to return something, so I'm going to return that data set. This means if anything goes wrong, of course, I'll be returning an empty data set. But that's okay. If I'm returning a data set and it'll meet the contract that anybody calling it will be looking for the Northwind data set. Now another thing I need is to dim a table adapter for sales. Has a new Northwind dataset table adapter dot sales category. All right, let's just make a little bit more screen real estate here. Now I have the new data set I want to return and a new table adapter to play with. Now, it's a good idea, in fact a great idea, to put a try-catch box here. And the reason you want to do that is because if this fails for any reason, what will actually happen is it'll return a SOAP exception, which, quite frankly, is useless. Your end user never wants to see a SOAP exception, and you don't want to have to catch one. I've suppressed the message here for catching the exception because I don't need it for anything, but I will make a note you should log something here. Alright, now how are we going to actually get this thing? Well, the technique is to just use this and fill the data set. Fill, and of course the specific thing I need in the data set is my sales. Sales by category table. Now that should do it. So let's take a look and see if it did. Let's run my web method and see what comes back. Okay, this popped up. And here, of course, is my schema. And if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see where the data actually starts to flow in. The schema is very important because in pulling the schema in as well, the application that uses it gets to understand the structure from which it was called. Alright, shut that down. Now we have our web service. How are we going to use such a thing? Okay, now we need to add an actual smart client to our application to use this web service so we can present the report. So I'm going to add a new project. It's going to be a Windows application, and we'll call it Smart Client. There's my form. And what we're looking for next is the tool that I would need, and that's under Data. Report Viewer, drag and drop that. And I won't need this right now, so I can go ahead and close it. We'll go ahead and dock that in its parent container. And one of its choices from the Smart tag is to choose a new report. But of course, we don't have one here. So the other choice we're going to need is design a new report. Now the report's going to need a data source. It doesn't know about the Northwind data set just yet. The project will, though. So I'm going to say add a new data source. I can use a database, a web service, or an object. We've got our web service, so let's take that. And we'll use one in the current solution. Cleverly named Service 1. And I can add that as a reference. Okay, now I have it under my local host. Not the best name for it. So let's go back here and say we'd like to rename that local host. Normally I'd name that when it was presented, but for some reason I didn't see it or I clicked too fast. Okay, and just to be safe, I'm going to tell it to go ahead and update the web reference. Alright, no complaints so far. So I can go to my data source again. I look over here and I see that there I have the local copy of the data set, which is essentially just the structure. So now I need to turn my toolbar back on, toolbox back on. And this time I'll be using, let's just take a table. We'll drag the table over here. Okay, now a table is very interesting in the report tool, and we'll talk about this a lot, but essentially what I need to do is to present my data as either a table or as a matrix, or you can use a list. And I'm going to choose a table for this opportunity. Go after the data, and in this case I'm going to say category name, product name, and product sales. Now, I still haven't gotten an actual copy of the data. The data is still sitting over my web service because I haven't requested it yet. So that means I have to go back over to my form in design mode and tell it that I now have a report that you can select from. There's my Smart Client Report 1. And I have to choose a data source. It knows about the data sources the project has, so that says OK. And I usually rebind just to be safe. Alright, now this still gives us a little bit of a problem because at this point nothing can really happen. let's go ahead and show you what I mean. I'm going to take this project, tell it that I need to have 2 startup projects, and then I want to start the web service and we'll start it with debugging, and we'll start the smart client right behind the web service. Apply that, and it's a good idea to tell this project I'm going to tell this form that I want it to start up in the center of the screen. So we're going to start this project, but first I want to go in and check to make sure that I have 2 projects starting up. I want a multiple project setup and the smart client both set to start. That's okay. And let's take a peek. Okay, my report was generated, but I didn't actually give it any data. So let's go back and do that. Closing these forms. And this time I'm going to go into the code behind of the form itself. Now there's a couple ways to do this. I'd recommend you centralize everything you use to access your data, but for our purposes, let's take a look at what we need. Well, the first thing we're going to want to have is an instance of the Northwind web service, service 1. Now that I have an instance of it, we'll create an instance of the data set to hold the data locally for me. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. I'm going to run it to the web service now and take the data set and just populate it. This instance will populate get sales by category. And let's take a look at our form. I now get a chance to choose the data source, and that says sales by category binding source. And if you look down here, I have an instance of that. So once I bind to that, I should be good to go. And as you can see, all I'm doing here is taking the data set and populating the data source on the form and then refreshing the report. Well, let's see what this would look like. Here's my web service coming up. There's my report, and there you have it. Not bad for a starter, huh? Okay, that would be too easy. If that's all they wanted, anybody could do that. We'd like to get into some more difficult reports. Okay, so before we get too far down the road in the report design, I want to take a minute and show you something here. And that's this RDL itself. I'm going to open this up for you just so we can take a quick peek. You won't normally have to do that, but I'm going to open it with an XML editor just so I can show you what it looks like. Alright, don't be nervous. What we have here is essentially just an XML file that keeps track of everything about the report design. And the beauty of the XML file is that it can be passed to and from firewalls or through firewalls without any binaries being handled. So it's a good thing to know about. You don't have to work with it, so we can relax there. Right, and keeping with dressing this report up a little bit, what I needed to go is to go to my toolbox, and I'll put a text box up here for the header. Now this time I'm going to go to expression, and I'm going to tell it that it's equal to sales by category of today. And of course that's not big enough for what I want, so I'm going to go to its properties and tell it that that's going to be sales by category of today of a large font, let's say 24. And that should be what I need. There's a few other tools you can use here. One of them I'd recommend right away is that you give yourself a little line for the header here. And that way the page header will have a nice little break between the header and the data. Make sure that's plenty big for what I need. And come down to the footer here. I'm going to add another text box. There's a series of handy built-in things you might want to take advantage of. For example, under globals here, I can say I want to have the page number of the total number of pages. See how that would look. Okay, now we're starting to see something that begins to look like a report. Before we get too far down this road, I need to take a couple minutes and show you a really interesting addition to reports. Make a little bit of screen real estate here. And I'm going to put in a matrix. Now, a matrix very closely resembles what we think of as pivot tables. But let me show you what it'll do for you. First thing I'll do is go back to my data set. I'll pick up the category name, and I'll drop into the columns. I'll pick up the product sales, and I'll drop it into data. And then I'll pick up the product name and drop it into rows. Now, with just that little bit of effort, I run the application. And as you can see, I now have, well, exactly what I asked for. Let's take a look at this and format it a little bit better. First thing I'd like to do with this, looking to make sure that I have my report borders illuminated, and I can take this box and say I want to have all borders. And then each of the internal ones, we'll make them all. Make that a little wider, and let's see what we get. Well, I hope you're fairly amazed at how quick and easy it was. There's my matrix, just like that. I'll clean it up a little bit. Make that a property with the format of C0 in this case. And I'll make that a bit wider and run it one more time. And there you have it, quick and easy client-side reports. They use a web service to fetch the data from a website connected to a back-end database. And this is a very easy process. This is Pat Tormey. Hope you've enjoyed this.